អង្គុយចុះ
The President, please be seated. The court is now back in session. Without further ado, we would like to now hand over to the prosecution to proceed with some more questions to the witness.
Thank you, Mr. President. Dr. Chun Lee, before the break, we were discussing the authority structure in charge of the hospitals, P1 and P2. Now, if we could please move now very quickly, if you could keep your answers brief, because we need to move on to other topics. Am I correct in understanding that the patients who were treated at P2, the military hospital, were soldiers, Khmer Rouge soldiers?
Response: yes, it is correct.
And based on what you observed, again, very, very briefly, was the medical care that was being provided in the hospital, was it adequate? Was it a good level of medical care?
Response: at the beginning, we could make use of the leftover medicines at the hospital, but by 1976 we had some malaria and antibiotic medicine from China. They were enough for supply at the hospital.
Thank you. Now, moving on to just one aspect of the functioning of that hospital, in your book you describe an individual whose name was Pon, who was director of the hospital. And there is one particular event that I wish to ask you about, in which you describe the activities of Pon. This is at Khmer ERN 00678-815 and English ERN 00369-723. You describe there seeing Pon walking hastily in and out of a surgery room, and you describe seeing a motionless young girl being taken out of that room, and then you say the following quote: "I quickly understood that Pon had taken the poor girl for doing practical and experimental surgery, as I used to hear Khmer Rouge staff talking about the way their surgeons were trained." And I'll stop there. Can you describe for us what you learned about what happened on that occasion with this person?
The President, Mr. Witness, could you please hold on? Counsel for Mr. Nuntia, you may now proceed.
Thank you, Mr. President. I object to this question. It is clearly outside the scope of what we should be discussing. It's not related to population movements, one or two. It's not related to communication structures or chains of authority. It is a touching episode in the book. We can agree on that, but it's not relevant when we are discussing the facts of the case in case 002/001.
if I could respond, Mr. President, in our submission it is highly relevant to the functioning of the authority structures that were put in place. I am being very selective and asking very few questions. This is relevant because it describes the functioning of a hospital which was, as we heard, under the Khmer Rouge authority structure, and it describes, in our submission, some of the policies and practices that were introduced. Those issues are within the scope of this trial. My questions will be very limited. I don't propose to spend significant time on this. So, with your leave, we would seek to question the doctor on this very, very briefly.
The President, the objection by counsel is not sustained. However, the Chamber also notes that this question has little relevance. So, Mr. Co-Prosecutor, you are now advised to make sure that your next line of questioning is more relevant.
Thank you, Mr. President. And with that in mind, I will simply limit myself to this one question, and if Dr. Chun-Li could describe very, very briefly what happened on this particular occasion at the P2 hospital.
The President, counsel for Mr. Noon Chie, could you be kind enough to wait until co-prosecutor made his question or pose his question to the witness first, because the objection was already ruled, and then we noted that that kind of question was not relevant and that he was advised to refrain. rephrase the question to make sure that it is relevant to the facts in case file 002/1.
Mr. President, I did not mean to be polite, but I think I heard the question posed by the prosecutor, and my new objection would then be that the question is irrelevant, and I find support in that position in your ruling just now that this line of questioning is not relevant. So I would object to this question on the basis of relevance and invite the prosecutor to move on.
Your Honours, the objection has been overruled. My learned friend is simply restating his initial objection. We could have by now dealt with the issue and moved on, and my learned friends are really wasting time now. If I could be permitted to continue.
The President, indeed, Mr. Co-Prosecutor, you can proceed putting some more questions to the witness. The objection has already been ruled upon.
So again, Dr. Chun Lee, in very, very brief terms, could you describe the incident?
Response. This event is very vivid in memory of mine, and I never forget it. On one occasion, I saw a young woman who came to the hospital. She was in her late teen a year, and she was wearing black clothes, and I asked her why she came here, and she said that she was asked to come and help arrange the medicine at the hospital because she could speak French. And then she said she was nervous. She didn't know why. And that time, a female medic of the Khmer Rouge assured her that she would not need to be afraid, and she would take her to see the head of the doctor. Later on, she was led away, but then a while later I saw a doctor came with some anesthetic, and the laryngoscope walking toward my opposite direction. I could see from the window that Pon, the head of the hospital, went into a room. A while later, I saw 4 Khmer Rouge soldiers carrying that motionless poor little girl in a stretcher and have her loaded onto a waiting vehicle parked in front of the hospital. Then the car drove off. And I noted immediately that the woman had been going under experimental surgery. 15 minutes later, I saw these people coming back to the hospital, and then they asked me for help. They cried in pain, and they said that the car overturned in front of Dam Raysor Pagoda. And I took that head of the hospital to be treated. He got injury on his left hand, and the other staffs could be well treated by other medical personnel. At the same time, when I was preparing to sew the injury of Pon, and then a Khmer Rouge came and asked what we should do with that enemy bitch. And Pon told me that let's get rid of her or just execute her. That's what I heard and saw. And in the late afternoon, medical staff told me that the young woman who was still influenced by the anesthetic was taken to a location near Moniwong Lycée and was then placed into the crematorium, a crematory oven alive.
Thank you, Dr. Chunli. We will move on to other topics. Now, again, I wish to spend very little time on this. The next hospital where you worked, and which you describe in your book, was the civilian hospital P1, the hospital you mentioned earlier. I wish to only ask you a couple of questions about the practices and policies that were in existence. You describe in your book that in this hospital, which was a hospital for the treatment of civilians, not Khmer Rouge soldiers, that there was a staff member, someone called Ron, whose task you describe as being to spy on the patients to identify enemies. And for the record, this section is at Khmer ERN 00678-842 and English 00369-741. Could you tell the court how you knew that this individual was tasked with spying on people to locate enemies?
Response. I had worked at the military hospital for 16 months. Then I worked for the civilian hospital for 2 months. I left the hospital on the 31st when the Chinese delegation paid a visit to the hospital on the 31st of January 1977. Ron did not have a regular work schedule. He was in charge of the laboratory, and there was not much for him to do. Ron was a cheerful person. We could see smile in his face all along, even when he was very angry. The angrier he was, the more smile we see on his face. And he said that by the evenings there would be some vehicles who come to pick up some patients out of the hospital, and he would be in charge of helping this.
How is it that you knew that people that were being taken away were identified as enemies?
Response. The vehicles came to the place, to the hospital. During the Khmer Rouge regime, it was rare to see vehicle coming to the place. And during the time when I was on duty to guard at the hospital or to be on standby, I saw a vehicle came in and left. And then I did not see the patient who would be there a moment ago before the car came.
And last question on that. At the pages which I indicated earlier, there is a passage which reads as follows, quote, when through his spying activities, he, that is Ron, had identified, quote, the enemies of the revolution, end quote, like civil servants, intellectuals, or so-called capitalists, he reported his findings to the, quote, upper level. Is that a correct summary of what you observed or learned during your stay at P1, that people being searched for, included civil servants, intellectuals, or so-called capitalists.
The President, Mr. Witness, could you please pause? You may now proceed. Response. Report was made to the upper echelon. I don't know where the echelon could have been located, but I saw vehicles coming to the place, to the hospital.
Thank you. Now, before we leave the functioning of the hospitals per se, I wish to ask you about the events which took place on the 30th of January 1977, which you mentioned earlier. At that point, you were relieved of your responsibilities. Can you tell the court very briefly how you were relieved of your responsibilities?
Response. I had nothing to be in charge of the hospital during the Khmer Rouge. I was an ordinary medical staff, or in other words, I am a prisoner of the Khmer Rouge at the hospital. I did not hold any higher position. However, when soldiers got injured, I would be called to treat them, but for civilian, if anyone was sick, they would not ask me to treat them. So I did not have any actual position. But on the 30th, the head of the hospital ordered to all medical personnel to clean both in and outside the hospital. In the evening of the 29th at 2 a.m., medical personnel would be cleaning the hospital complex without worrying of disturbing the patients. By 8 a.m., the hospital was clean, and there was another order to close all the hospital windows, and that no patients or medical personnel were allowed to leave the hospital, because we were asked to only stay there and have meals at the hospital. At 10 a.m., I could see from the office where I worked the vehicle loaded with Chinese delegation coming to the hospital. I saw Chinese people who were wearing white short-sleeved shirt. The car was there for a while, about an hour before it left. It was on the 30th of January 1977. By late afternoon, I was called and told that Angkar would like us to go back to the cooperative. So by the 31st of January 1977, I returned to the cooperative and became the farmer doing farming.
Were you the only doctor who was told to return to the cooperatives on that day, or were there other doctors?
In the Battambong, the Khmer Rouge established a district hospital. It was actually a former school, and 1 or 2 health staff were assigned to work there. As for myself, while I was at the P2 hospital belonged to the sector, and after 16 months, I was sent to work at P1 hospital, which was a civilian hospital. There were 4 of us, myself, another physician, another X-ray technician, and another repairman or technician.
My question was simply whether other doctors were sent away back to the cooperatives on the same day or around the same period when you were sent away.
When I left the hospital, I returned to the cooperative to work the rice field.
I think we may have interpretation issues, but I will move on in the interest of time. At the end of chapter 6 of your book, you provide a conclusion as to your experiences at the 2 hospitals. And this is the last aspect of the hospitals that I wish to ask you about. And this is at Khmer ERN 00678846 and English ERN 003697444. And I will read 2 brief passages. First you say, most of the patients who came from the cooperatives ended their lives in Hospital P1, that is a civilian hospital, and their valuable properties were pillaged by Khmer Rouge staff. Some patients became Khmer Rouge's prey for their criminal, practical and experimental surgery. Moreover, civilian Hospital P1 was a Khmer Rouge's spy place to identify and eliminate people who they considered to be enemies of the revolution. In short, the military hospital was a facility for taking care and for promoting health of Angkar's Khmer Rouge soldiers. The civilian hospital was merely an antechamber of death for Cambodian people. That last passage where you make a distinction between hospital, the military hospital and the civilian hospital, is that an accurate summary of what you were seeing and your impressions at the 2 hospitals?
That is my personal conclusion. At the military hospital, patients who were rather healthy and did not have diseases like diarrhea or malnutrition, they would be there at the military hospital, and during a meal time they would be asked to eat around a table. Although the food was not that adequate, it was almost enough for all the patients. On the contrary, at the civilian hospital, patients were mostly had this kind of hygiene disease, including diarrhea, dysentery, malnutrition, edema, and they were kind of emaciated. They had 2 meals per day, while at the military hospital the patients had 3 meals. And when they were eating, they would eat in a row, not at a round table, and they would put the food in the middle of the road. Patients at that civilian hospital, when they died, their entire property would be confiscated by the Khmer rules. I knew a teacher who had a 7G of gold. He actually asked to give the gold to me, but I refused to take it. And on that day, 2 patients died. The dead person were not moved from their beds until the late evening when a pedal cart came to pick the dead bodies. And the properties of those dead patients were confiscated by the Khmer rules. Even the medicine that was given by the Chinese were not given sufficiently to the patients. The Khmer rules would steal some of those medicine. And the Khmer rules actually hated any patient with a light complexion. And another point, for surgery, and this is applies to both P1 and P2, and this is from my personal experience. There was a woman who was mentally retarded. She sang and then she walked away from the hospital. Health staff then whipped her up and took her back into the hospital. Later, the chief of the hospital said that that patient would be sent back to the village. But as I observed, that patient was put on a stretcher and she was put under anesthetic, and then she was put into a vehicle and left. It is my conclusion that she was sent for an experimental surgery. Although I did not witness that experimental surgery myself, but I saw that patient under anesthetic taken away. As for the civilian hospital, it was also a dangerous place. It was a place where they searched out for the enemy, including public officials. And when they were targeted as enemies, then they would be taken out.
Oh, thank you. We will move on to a slightly different topic. You discuss in your book a period in, I believe it is in August 1975, where you had permission to visit your family in the Damre Slap village, and you describe people who had arrived, newcomers that arrived in the village. This is at Khmer ERN 00678804 and following, and English ERN 00369716. You discuss here seeing the newcomers in the Battambang region, and you say, I'll just read one brief passage. I met a physician whose name were similar to mine, Chin Lee, and another physician named Long Naret, and his wife who used to work in Kampong Cham town. They said the Khmer Rouge loaded people in the train from Phnom Penh and dropped them at different stations, such as Svai Dong Khao in Persat province, and then Mong Rusei, Phnom Tapdai, Battambang town, and other stations on the way to Sisopon. can I just have you first confirm, did you yourself see some of these newcomers apart from this individual that you talked to, Mr. Chen Li?
That was the time the Khmer Rouge transferred people from Phnom Penh to Battambang by train. Some of them were settled in my village.
Thank you. I'll ask you another question. Can you describe for the court, or rather, well, let me ask you first, what were the conditions in which those people were left when they arrived in Battambang? Was there sufficient provision made for their accommodation, food, etc.?
Those evacuees had to find food by themselves. However, as for the best people, when they had a free piece of land, those evacuees were allowed to settle in that free plot of land, or sometimes they even share the houses with the evacuees. But most of the time they would build their shade or shelter or accommodation on the free plot of land.
Thank you very much. Now, further on in your book, you describe what happened to some of these evacuees, and this is at Khmer ERN 00678-836 and English ERN 00369-736. And I'm paraphrasing, but in that passage you describe in your words, a starvation, and you also state that from among approximately 100 Islamic Khmer families who had been displaced, only about half of them had survived. Could you tell the court very briefly about what you saw and what was related to you by your family about the starvation which took place and which affected these people?
Starvation did not exist in 1975, but it was in late 1976, if I am not mistaken. Because in 1975 we still had some reserved food. When those people coming from Phnom Penh to settle in my village, I myself, as well as my mother, went looking around in the hope that we would find some of our relatives, but we did not. However, I made some friends. At that time, we could manage to have sufficient food. However, by the end of 1976, a lot of people died. As for the Islam population who settled there, half of them died. And for the Sikh Cham people who could not go to work, their ration would be cut, and they were also forced to eat pork.
If I could just ask you a little bit further about the starvation and the circumstances surrounding it. At Khmer ERN 00678822 and English ERN 003697727, you're discussing the period after the Khmer New Year in 1976. And in other words, immediately preceding that famine. And you say the following quote, "The Khmer Rouge pretended the stock of rice was going to run out. In fact, people saw trucks transporting out regularly rice from the warehouse." Can I ask you first how you were able to learn that information, that rice was regularly transported out of warehouses?
The Khmer Rouge gathered the people to dismantle wooden houses in Battambang in order to build a commune warehouse to store rice. The villagers and myself saw trucks coming to transport rice from the warehouse outside, although we did not know where the rice was transported to. Villagers at that time was distributed rice taken from the warehouse, and later on they said that the warehouse was running out of rice. And that is my personal experience, that is seeing trucks coming to take away the rice from the commune warehouse.
Thank you. Now, if we move on to yet another brief topic, and it is your discussion of the people living in Wat Kor commune. And this section starts at Khmer ERN 00678828 and English 003697731, and you first state that you knew Nuon Chia's family very well and that they lived in a big wooden house at Wat Kor commune. A little bit further down, you say the following, quote, "Under the Khmer Rouge regime, Wat Kor commune enjoyed special treatment. Unlike other communes, Wat Kor residents were not displaced. Moreover, they received sufficient ration." A little bit further down, while people in other communes were starving, Wat Kor commune's daily food supply never changed. Nuon Chia's mother also received special treatment. She was regularly given a full bag of rice, fishes, sugar, salt, and other supplies. Are those passages from your personal experience, from the information you obtained during the Khmer Rouge period?
I knew Wat Kor village since I worked in Battambang province in 1967. The Wodgo villagers were kind of a wealthy class, and a number of intellectuals actually came from Wodgo village. And some government officials also came from the Wodgo village. I also knew Nunchi's family. But in fact, the family of Nunchi was a good family like the rest of the villagers in that village. I used to provide treatment to him and to his family members at the Wodgo village. And some of the medical staff also came from Wodgo village. Under the Khmer Rouge regime, one of Nunchi's younger siblings, who was a custom officer, was not taken anywhere. He became a driver during the regime, which was a contrast from other previous regime officers. Secondly, under the Khmer Rouge regime, Wodgo village residents, regardless whether the person was a young one or an adult, received the same food ration. And wherever there was insufficient food elsewhere in other villages, the food ration in Wodgo village did not change. I also knew the person who supplied food to Nunchi's mother, because he was the same person who gave food supply to the hospital where I worked, that is P1 and P2 hospital.
Thank you. Now, if I can ask you about the changes in the authority structure of the Northwest Zone that you describe in your book. And in chapters 8 and 9, you discuss this extensively, the disappearances of Northwest Zone cadre and arrival of West Zone cadre. And in fact, you witnessed one such arrest by people arriving on a boat. Time is limited, so I'm going to be selective. Looking at a passage that deals with a meeting that you attended. Now, this is in the period late 77, early 1978. It's in chapter 10 of your book. And the specific passage is found at Khmer ERN 00678-865 and English ERN 00369-758. You discussed meetings that you were required to attend at night and some of the new rhetoric of the Khmer Rouge cadres which you heard. And according to this passage, there was discussion of the situation of the enemies inside the country and situation of the enemies outside the country. And if I can quote you here, concerning the situation of the enemies inside the country, the Khmer Rouge cadres cited the internal enemies burrowing through the party from inside, the CIA agents, the KGB agents, the reactionists, the revisionists among our cadre at all levels, who must be destroyed by our great and radical revolution. Is this a form of, or let me rephrase that, is this something you heard personally at meetings that you attended?
Yes, I heard the phrase with my own ears. At night, after an exhausting day, all workers were required to attend a meeting. I personally did not like the meeting, but the same phrase kept repeating itself. That is about the situation of the enemies inside the country and outside the country, and that phrase. And that's why it stuck in my mind.
Let me ask you this. Were those meetings taking place in the same period when you observed the disappearance of Northwest Zone cadre and their replacement by people from the West Zone? Was that the same period or was it a different time?
President, witness, please wait until the microphone is operational. Witness, I did not see the disappearance of the cadres of the Northwest, but I saw them being replaced by the cadres from the West. And I witnessed one incident where the cadre was arrested and taken by boat, as you stated earlier.
Thank you. Dr. Chunli, we discussed earlier an individual whose name was Pek Ken, alias Sumet, the Sector 3 Secretary. Do you know what happened to him?
President, Prosecutor, could you please rephrase your question? In particular, please mention the names precisely so that the interpreter could interpret it properly.
Thank you, Mr. President. An individual that we discussed earlier, Kek Ben, alias Su, who was secretary of one of the sectors in the Northwest Zone, and a person that you described earlier. Do you know what happened to him during the Khmer Rouge period?
I did not know, because at that time it was a period of screening or purging, so I did not know what happened to the person.
Thank you. Mr. President, with your leave, I would like to show the witness a document and to see simply whether he can identify the individual mentioned there. And this document is D108/26.104. It is an S21 prisoner list. And I simply wish to confirm whether the individual mentioned there corresponds to the individual that our witness has been discussing.
President, yes, you may proceed.
And with your leave, I do have a hard copy for the witness. It might be a little bit easier for him to read, if I may hand that to him.
Court officer, can you take the hard copy document for the witness examination?
Thank you, Your Honours. The Khmer ERN, if the court officer could assist, is 00869 631, and I'm asking my case manager to project that on the screen so everybody's looking at the same page. So, Dr. Chun Lee, it's 000866931, the document in your copy. The ERN in French is 00864730271. In English, 008376110. Dr. Chun Lee, if you look at section 6 in that document, I'm reading from the English document, so I hope you can follow me in Khmer. Section 6 is entitled Sector 4. The individual listed as number 29 is Kek Pen, alias Su, Sector Secretary. If you can read that, is that the same person, at least as far as the name is concerned? Is that the same name as the individual who you were describing earlier today?
I cannot say for sure because he was known as Kai Pain, alias Kamrat Su, but here it mentioned Kai Pan, alias Su.
Thank you. That's all we need. We can move on from that. Mr. President, would you like me to stop here?
President, thank you. Court officer, can you remove the document from the witness? The time is now appropriate for an adjournment for today's proceeding, and we will resume tomorrow morning, Friday, 7 December 2012, starting from 9 a.m. For tomorrow's proceeding, we will continue to hear the testimony of Mr. Hun Chun Lee. Mr. Hun Chun Lee, the hearing of your testimony has not yet concluded. We will continue to hear your testimony again tomorrow, and you are invited to do so. Court officer, in collaboration with Wisu, could you assist the witness for his return to his residence and have him return at the courtroom tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Security guards, you are instructed to take the three accused to the detention facility and have them return tomorrow morning at the courtroom before 9 a.m. As for Mr. Yansari, please take him to the holding cell downstairs, which the audio-visual linked so that he can follow the proceeding remotely. The court is now adjourned.